I would like to thank the AIC for inviting me to present on the occasion of the organization's 50th anniversary, and within the theme of Melting Pot, Identities and Movement. I'm presenting Documenting the Inheritance of Post-Indentureship. I would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their support in the creation of this work and the Ontario Arts Council for exhibition assistance. I will be speaking to the little-known histories of South Asian indentured workers in the 19th and early 20th century in the Caribbean. I'm going to trace that legacy through my sculpture practice with specific reference to my late father, who was born in Trinidad in 1930, and explore how his ancestry relates to me and the choices I make in my studio practice. Now, most of us in the Western world, or indeed globally, have at least a vague understanding of the atrocities that befell over 12 million Africans who were forcibly removed from their homes and shipped and sold for hard labor beginning in the 16th century during the great transatlantic slave trade. A lesser-known history is that of the people who replaced the slaves when they were emancipated by their colonial masters in the 1830s. The British, in particular, were desperate to find cheap labor to work their cash crops, mainly sugar, but also cocoa, coffee, pineapples, and bananas. They tried the Scottish and the Portuguese, but in the end, they settled on one of their largest colonies, India. A largely vegetarian people, cheap to feed, with thousands eager to improve their lives. Nearly 1.5 million South Asians were indentured in the colonies between 1838 and 1917. They were shipped to work in East Africa, South Africa, Fiji, Malaysia, Singapore, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Jamaica. And of the 1.5 million, 500,000 sailed to the Caribbean to work the sugar plantations. They came as indentured workers. Indentureship is the state of being or period of being a servant bound to service for a specific time in return for passage to a colony. So indentureship is not limited to a region. It happened in North America and Europe, but I'm going to focus on the Indo-Caribbeans and my own family history. And in this case, indentureship generally meant signing up for 5 or 10 years of hard labor in exchange for $1 a day, food and lodging, in the very shacks that the slaves had recently vacated, and often suffering similar punishments and living conditions as the slaves, with an offer of either land or return passage home. In the 1950s, my parents married in Ontario, Canada, at a time when interracial marriage was illegal in several American states and extremely uncommon in both the US and Canada. And my mother was American. I grew up in New Brunswick on the east coast of Canada in the 1970s and 80s, and I was one of a handful of brown faces in a sea of white. So race, identity, and belonging have always and continue to inform my practice. Like many artists, I first turned to autobiography as a source of inspiration. The work I created during my formative years in college just over a decade ago explores my mixed race identity. I was throwing different shades of clay together on the wheel, altering them, intertwining the bands of clay, somewhat like a helical structure of interconnected strands of DNA. This is my family portrait that graphically depicts the mixes in my family: Irish, Scottish, Indian, Trinidadian, Guyanese, Hindu, Muslim, Protestant, and Catholic. And for the first time, I started to think about myself within my family as a person of mixed Indo-Caribbean identity, expressing the legacy of post-indentureship. After my MFA at OCADU, the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto, Canada, I sought out Project Network, which is an international gathering of recent ceramic graduates at Gulyago International Research Center in Denmark in the fall of 2014. This was the first time I built multi-part molds, and the first time I started using photographic image on porcelain, working with representation of body. After Gulyago, I was debilitated with kidney disease for about 18 months, but when I emerged, I turned again to abstract representation of self. In 2020, I expanded this work into 15 pieces and started to wade into the space of vulnerability and really looking at myself graphically and conceptually, and starting to wonder where I fit in. While I was recovering, my father was failing. I felt an urgency to document his life, so in January 2016, I asked my father if I could photograph his body close up for this hanging mobile project. My father was enthusiastic about the project, and I created a topography of his emaciated body, documenting his scars from childhood abuse and past surgeries at close range, and incorporating what I call memory photos of his young adulthood in Trinidad and his early years in Canada as a new father. Again, this was my first conscious foray into archive, and my first real look at what my father's life was like as an immigrant, not merely as my father. And many scholars call this migration from the Caribbean to the New World, the US, Canada, or the UK, a double diaspora, where the first diaspora was the migration from India to the Caribbean. The next year, in 2017, was Canada's sesquicentennial, and for my nation's 150th birthday, I decided to explore through Family Archive how I, as a brown girl who grew up in a predominantly white community, fit into the Canadian landscape. I am literally at the corners of Canadianness, doing ballet, ice skating, cooking lobster, surrounded by iconic Canadiana on the faces of these slipcast forms. The Beaver, the Mounted Police, the Queen, the Loons, the Moose, Wayne Gretzky. I started to think more about abstract representation and its relationship to archival photography and my mixed Caribbean Anglo-European heritage. I built a small set of building blocks. I took this piece to Tasmania for the Australian Ceramics Triennial to provoke discussion around decolonizing clay. And then I built more building blocks. And then I built more building blocks. And literally, we are all the sum of those who came before us. I had a rule: equal numbers of my father's and my mother's families on each piece, and every image must have been taken before I was born. These are my mother's maternal grandparents and their siblings. Her family came from Ireland during the potato famine in 1865. They came to Canada to work the fertile farmlands north of Toronto. These are my great-grandparents in Trinidad, Jadu Maharaj, who changed his name to James McKenzie, and his wife, Louisa Simon, formerly Sonaman, whose ancestors sailed from Calcutta to Guyana to work the sugarcane fields in 1845 and 1864, respectively. This is Louisa with my grandfather, babe in arms, and the aunt that my father lived with as a teenager. The mixing of and trading of offspring within extended families was very common in the Caribbean. Now this is my great-great-grandmother Runia, who lived to be 105 and died in 1936. She made the 3-month journey across the Kalapani, the Black Waters, from India to Guyana. We don't know much about Runia's story, but we do know that women did not travel with their spouses very often. They came alone. They were outcasts, widows, fallen women, prostitutes, fleeing difficult circumstances in hopes of a better life. We will come back to Runia. In the summer of 2019, I was invited to do a small exhibition at the Gardner Museum shop in Toronto, and I decided to present my work on Family Archive, Family Matters. My father had passed shortly after I had put up the mobile tribute to his life, Body Interrupted, in June of 2016, and I knew I had to tell his story in this exhibition. But I also knew I couldn't install a hanging work in the space. This is the youngest known existing photograph of my father at the age of 10 in Trinidad, which I was gifted by his sister in 2018. I decided to frame my father's life in sepia archival tones on ceramic substrate cards. My father, the academic, the photographer. My father, the husband and the father. My father, myth-busting the roles of persons of color in the Canadian landscape in the 1950s. The precariousness of my father's life as an immigrant building a home in a new land was a house of cards. Immediately prior to the exhibition, I took a break from researching indentureship and my family history, and I went to an artist residency in Alberta, the Shaw Centre in Medicine Hat at Medalta in the historic Clay District. I went to build big, and what I found myself making was a huge paisley. Paisley is an iconic symbol that relates to both Scottish textile industry and it has its roots in South Asia. The almond pit shape has become symbolic of a plurality of cultures across India and its diaspora. So I found myself still working on creating sculpture based on my ancestors' legacies. Inspired by Runia, I continue to delve more deeply into the history of indentureship. I participated in the World India Diaspora Congress in Trinidad in 2020, and I researched more fully the stories and lives of the Indian women who came to work on the plantations in the Caribbean. These are a few of the postcards that were created for Western travelers, taken by European photographers, staged and costumed, exoticizing the women for European travelers to show off how well they were treating our coolies, or Hindu women. Now remember, these women were plantation servants. So I was inspired to make these light boxes to literally illuminate the lives of these women and to give the women some agency and dignity in contextualizing their stories. This is an image of what a typical British Victorian drawing room or parlor might have looked like, and it could very well have been in the homes of the plantation owner during the indentureship. And this is the room divider that was part of the drawing room's furniture. This is an image on porcelain tile of the typical living quarters of the indentured laborers who displaced the African slaves and took on their dwellings. And here's my sculptural interpretation of the divider I call division, where each pane has a photographic image of the lived experiences of the indentured workers, metaphorically bringing their lives into the living spaces of their masters. A close-up. The porcelain tiles are hand-pressed, fired, slow-cooled, and they're refired with iron oxide decals. The most recent iteration of the work now doubled in scale. The last piece in the series, so far, was inspired by the Patel Rozak, which was the first ship to carry Indians to Trinidad in 1843. As part of the celebrations of the 175th anniversary of the landing of the Patel Rozak, in May of 2020, the government of Trinidad and Tobago released to the public the images of the ship's manifest. When I saw these images, I knew I had to put them on porcelain sails and recreate the ship. So here is the ceramic ship. And these are the portholes that carry images of British coins and British Indian coins from 1843 that draws attention to the commodification of human labor at the time. This was a very brief telling of a whole people's history through art. There's a lot more left to explore, uncover, and present. And I'm currently working on a new project that carries the diaspora through to Canada and explores through a feminist lens past and contemporary matriarchal lines of Caribbean women living in Canada. I'd like to invite you to reach out. You can find me and my contact information at my website at heidimckenzie.ca. Thank you.